gonna do that thing, but we don't have to get started like as soon as possible. Let's see, it's setting up your meeting from YouTube Live, done redirecting to YouTube. Okay, and then if you would like to share the link, here we go.
It's the same link that was being shared yesterday, right?
It should be, yes.
So have you guys done panels during the pandemic?
I've done them on and off, mostly recorded panels. I did one the other day. I had to record for like a science fiction studies lecture. I don't know, the convention's coming up in like a month, and so we'll see how that goes.
This is only my second panel, and the first one I did had way too many authors on it, so it was everybody jockeying, trying to get a little airtime.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Now, are you fine if I record this by chance? Is anyone against recording?
Do it.
Yeah.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and do that record thing. Record to the cloud. We're all in the cloud. All right. Let's go ahead and get started here. Hello, everybody watching. Hello, anybody else dropping in on and off. Welcome. This is Thinking of Tomorrow, Furry Science Fiction and Critical Utopian Spaces. My name is Brandy J. Lewis. I am a fourth-year PhD student at the University of California, Riverside in Southern California. I specialize in science fiction studies, utopian theory, archive studies, as well as a little bit of queer theory and film and media studies. Today, we have three amazing furry fiction and science fiction authors with us. We have Mary E. Loud, Greg Luderman, and Rick Griffin. And so we're going to go ahead and get started and do introductions. And this stream will be recorded just so that way we have it available not only for academic purposes, but also for our fans, our loved ones, so we can see what is the work that we do, what are the texts that we're interested in and passionate about, and what is it, hopefully for ourselves, that we wish to continue thinking about into the future. And so before we get started, I do want to do a quick land acknowledgement. While all of us here are speaking from different parts of North America, near and far, I would like to acknowledge that this talk today is predominantly being held on the land of the Gabrielino Tongva people, past and present, who continue to honor their history and inspire many to do what is needed. And so I'm going to go ahead and get started with introducing our three authors with us. First off, we have Mary E. Loud. Mary E. Loud is a prolific science fiction and furry writer living in Oregon of the United States. She's had nearly 200 short stories and more than a dozen books published, including the Otters in Space trilogy from Fur Planet, and most recently, the Entangled Universe trilogy from Atheon Books. She's edited 5 volumes of Fur Planet's annual anthology series, Roar, and she's the founder and editor of the first professional level furry zine, Zooscape. Congratulations by chance.
Yeah.
Mary's work has won 7 Leo Literary Awards, 2 Coyote Awards, and 2 Ursa Major Awards. She's also received more Ursa Major Award nominations than any other individual and had more short stories published in daily science fiction than anyone else. She lives with an ever-evolving menagerie of cats, dogs, the occasional fish, and countless varieties of imaginary animals. Welcome, Mary. Next, we have Greg Luderman. Greg Luderman is a science fiction author who has published 5 novels, a handful of short stories, and co-edited an anthology of science fiction short stories. He's got the only book that's won all 3 of the fandom's literary awards, the Ursa Major, the Coyote, and the Leo Literary Award. His twin passions are telling great stories and helping aspiring writers do the same. His novel credits include a science fiction action and adventure trilogy called The Conti Cycle, a sci-fi murder mystery called Reaper's Lottery, A Long Way Home, an erotica that was spicy enough to get banned from Amazon. Welcome, Greg. And last but not least, we have Rick Griffin. Rick Griffin is an artist and author and is to blame for the worlds and works of House Pets, the award winner. He's the winner of multiple Ursa Major Awards, A&H Club, Haven Celestia, and the In Progress novel trilogy, Final Days of the White Flower 2, Pit Fighters, In the New Age, and more to be seen at some point. As a child, Rick Griffin frequently played out elaborate stories with stuffed animals and became weird in the head due to it and associated traumas. Therefore, he decided that when he grew up, he would tell stories for a living and also become a real-life dragon or perhaps a kangaroo. Naturally, everyone shook their head at the young boy's naivete, since as adults, they knew that it was impossible to write stories as one's sole career. They calmly explained that maybe he should get a job one day as well, and yet the whole day job thing didn't pan out. And so welcome, Rick.
Oh.
I'm really excited to have all three of you. I think at multiple points within my history of being in the fandom, I can each pinpoint where your works have touched on me, have influenced me, from House Pets to Mary's brilliant work with Star Trek, and of course with Greg's Conti Cyclotext. I think that's the most recent for me to pick up, and I just devoured it in an entire weekend. But I think a lot of what your works really speak to, particularly out of the animal alien kind of characters and the use of fantasy, speculative fiction, science fiction, is this real playful way of not only seeing the world from different perspectives, but thinking about the world in other imagined ways. And so it's a great chance to get to talk to all of you here and think about not only the great works you produce and will continue to produce, hopefully, but also a little bit about yourselves and kind of what went into the works. I do want to start us off with our first question, just to get things going. How long have you, and it feels like this is always the question with when it comes to furry fandom stuff, how long have you each been in the fandom, if not just starting out? I'm going to start just by the order of those in the call and start out with you, Mary, if that's all right.
Sure. I discovered the furry fandom in 2010. I had written the first Otters in Space book and knew that it was really unlikely that I would get it published by any mainstream publishers. And self-publishing was just starting to be a thing then that was, taken more seriously and easier to do. So I self-published it and was looking for places to tell people about it. And I, come to writing Otters in Space partly from the Brian Jakes Redwall books. I loved those when I was a kid and never got over it. And so I thought, well, people who like the Redwall books would probably like these because that's like mice with swords and this is otters with spaceships, it's a natural follow-up. But there were no active Redwall message boards anywhere, but I found furry message boards and I started hanging out in them, and it was people who talked about animals and things that interested me, and it was such a great space. And then people on the message board mentioned Rainforest, so I went up to Rainforest with a suitcase of self-published books, having no idea what to expect at all, and found tables of books and publishers devoted to furry fiction and panels of people talking about furry fiction, and heard this amazing speech by Phil Goyce, who likes to write about rabbits, about how furry fiction is where science fiction was about 100 years ago, just this sort of small group, but starting to expand and become a full genre. And it was so inspiring, and I've never looked back.
Very nice, thank you. And I think anytime I go into a furry convention space, it's like a little kick in my soul, a reminder that wait, there are other people who are doing things that I enjoy, and this is well received and celebrated. How can I further get into this? It's like every convention, it's almost kind of like it awakens me in some way. And I'm sure for all of you, you feel that whether you attend conventions actually or you see it online, the energy that fans bring.
Mhm.
Now, let's go ahead and follow next with Greg. Tell us a little bit about yourself and your fandom experience.
Well, I suppose I've been a furry for as far back as I can remember. I grew up on Saturday morning cartoons, and each of the decent ones features at least one animal person. In fact, I don't think I ever cared about any of the human characters. I started writing fiction in the late 70s. And by the early 80s, my writing had turned exclusively furry. So back then, I had no idea that there was a fandom. I think there was, but I certainly didn't know about it. But I was writing what I wanted to read, and that turns out to be furry.
Very nice. Now I have to ask, did you have any like favorite characters that you played with and toyed with that was kind of like not necessarily representing you, but like the stories you took part in and kind of where you grew up, how you came to be in the fandom? Did you have any particular characters you enjoyed?
My characters aren't terribly autobiographical. I don't think I ever role played someone that I thought of as me. I would make up a character and I would tell a story, but I kind of feel like I'm one of the few furries in the fandom that doesn't really have a persona of my own. I love telling stories, but it's just not, it's not me. It's stories that I want to tell. I mean, I've got, my favorite animal, so I get art drawn of donkeys because I love donkeys. I guess I don't really have a donkey character that is me.
Yeah, and I think I heard you, Mary. You yourself, I believe, if I'm correct, you yourself also don't have a persona of your own.
Not really. I identify with lots of the characters I write, like often multiple characters in a single book who are wildly different from each other. So none of them are really my persona, though.
Right. I mean, you can see elements of yourself in anything you create because that's what you're drawing on, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. And on the opposite spectrum, there's me with too many characters to list. And I think that leads us to Rick, where I remember, if I recall, Rick's character has different forms and shapes to them. So if you can go on, Rick, tell us a little bit about yourself, your work, how long you've been in the fandom.
Sort of hard to pin down exactly when I started in the fandom, because if you're going like officially, it's like somewhere between 1999 and 2004, and it's like I usually pin it down to 2004 because that's when I first got my DeviantArt account, and when I started doing like a general furry artwork. Before that, it was mostly dragons and then Pokemon, and then I was like writing fan fiction in the early 2000s, Pokemon fan fiction and other Nintendo fan fiction in the early 2000s. Eventually, I finally decided, I kind of want to do stuff that I could get published and not just fan fiction. So like I pivoted to general furry stuff around that time. Like also in 2004, I started my first webcomic in the New Age, which some people probably know that I've kept prodding at it over the years. But the very early incarnation was not very good. But I still wanted to do a comic all the time. And so I figured, I'll just do the thing that I did when I was young and make comics that were sort of like Garfield. And that's where House Pets came from. So I started that 2008, and that's kept going because I don't know how to stop. at the same time, I've always also just wanted to write other stories. It's not just comics. I'm not solely interested in comics. I'm also interested in prose. I'm interested in video games. I'm interested in animation. I'm interested in all sorts of things. I want to tell all sorts of stories. So that's um, so I started attempting to just write prose like back in my fan fiction days, and eventually finally started rolling into short stories, and then Greg picked up one of my short stories, 10,000 Miles Up, and he wrote his own fan fiction of it, which became Skeleton Crew. And so uh since he, I thought it was like really good. Like at first I was like, oh yeah, people write fan fiction all the time. Yeah, that's fine. It's like I guess I'll get around to reading it at some point. And then I finally read it and I was like, this is amazing.
I think I read it like in one lunch session. Like I read a good chunk of it, and then like by the end of the day, I was just like, "Where's the next one?" But that was picked up, of course, by your work, Rick, and same thing with Mary. Like you can fall in love with these characters, and I it's easy to say that it's because they're animals and we can see them the way we do as furry fans and fans of animal characters, but the writing is just so good and so like leading you onto the story and what happens to the characters. But with Greg's, I was also just like, wait, this world got bigger.
Yeah, it's sort of spiraled out of control now, because after Greg wrote his and then he wrote sequels, and I was like, you know what? I've been trying to write a novel for a while. This is a good excuse. So I'll just completely rewrite 10,000 Miles Up as a trilogy. And that's been going on for a couple years now, and 2 books in.
You did it originally as like a 300,000 word draft or something.
Yeah.
Break this up.
The first draft was like 300,000 words, and that's I might have been able to pare that down to 1 book, but having 3 is just nicer.
And Mary, with your worlds and your texts, I think I've gone from one trilogy to the next trilogy to the next trilogy, and so in a similar way, it's like you opened one world and then you moved into, well, what's the next story that I can move to, and how does that develop into another world that I can imagine?
They're actually almost all in the same world, even though it's not obvious as you're reading them.
Yeah.
I'm working on the 4th Otters in Space right now, and it will actually explicitly tie the Otters in Space trilogy to the Entangled Universe trilogy.
Mm-hmm.
Like they're written in kind of different styles, but in my head, it's, this is what's going on back at Earth with all the animals who've been uplifted, and the humans are out in space with all the animal-like aliens.
Yeah.
There are so many different ways to do furry characters in science fiction, and my take is, why not just have them all in the same world? Uplifted animals, animal-like aliens, transformation where humans have turned themselves into whatever they feel like being. Those can all coexist.
Right, and that leads into our next couple of questions, actually. For you 3, what makes you really excited about writing not only furry fiction, but within furry science fiction? What does it allow? What kind of stories do you feel the genre opens you up to? I think we could talk a little bit about that, and just kind of how is it productive in certain ways that you really find you're passionate about. And I think let's go in reverse this time, and if that's all right, we'll start with you, Rick.
Repeat the question.
Yes. So what is productive to you about not only like furry, but furry sci-fi? How is the genre and the subgenre of like furry, how does it allow you certain things that maybe other styles of storytelling do not?
Like science fiction with
Yeah.
furry?
Yeah.
Oh, let's see. You skipped a question. I have my notes right here.
oh yeah, they kind of blended in together. So I thought let's shape this kind of in together as one, maybe.
Okay, so like I like I feel the reason that furry and science fiction go well together is, well, fiction in general is hyper focused on humans and human problems. But the big difference is in furry, you're also exploring other types of self. I mean, it's still technically about people, but the definition of people gets expanded when you get into furry. So you can explore this in like fantasy and contemporary fiction just fine, but if you want to dig in, then science fiction gives you an excuse to dig in. And that's basically why sci-fi is really good for furry.
Right, right. What do you think, Greg? How do you feel about sci-fi and kind of what it allows you to do?
For me, I mean, I want to write furry. Furry is where my passion is. So I'm going to write a furry story. But in every furry story, you're either going to explain why furries exist or you won't. Mm-hmm. And I've always found that the stories that do explain are a lot more satisfying than the ones that just, oh, it's just, there's just furries in this world. And so if you're going to explain, then you've really only got a couple options. I mean, either you go with furries were created by magic, or it's some sort of sci-fi story. Mm-hmm. And magic's fine, but again, sci-fi reasons are just more satisfying. There's an explanation there that makes it more whole instead of just, oh, this wizard did it. And I like that. I connect to being able to tell more about why. And when you write science fiction furry, it gives you lots of great options. I mean, you can have aliens that just happen to look like animals or happen to be covered in fur. You can have characters that are genetically engineered. You can have virtual reality personas. You can have characters that evolved in a post-apocalyptic world. There's lots and lots of fun settings that you can do once you're writing in furry sci-fi. So it's a rich ground to till.
Right, right. And for me, what I like and what you speak towards, what I like about furry sci-fi is, as you said, sci-fi gives a little bit more structure to how furries exist and why. And in a way that opens space to like the allegorical proponents where we start to see ourselves in the character because it feels a little bit more realistic and grounded. That makes us think about the people we know and love, our friendships, our the ways in which we go about society. I know with the Conti cycle as well as the Rick's text, there's questions about capitalism and how we labor and work, and yet we're caught in these structures of oppression and use value. And so I think it's that structure that sci-fi gives that really allows us not only to fall into the text, but also to imagine the world in different creative ways.
I don't really analyze stuff very deeply when I write, but I have a lot of frustrations with capitalism, and they definitely come out in my writing. There's a lot of, okay, here's shit that's totally not a healthy society, and it's very, very similar to ones we're familiar with.
Right. And then how about you, Mary? What do you find useful for you, helpful? Where do you find yourself when you're writing furry science fiction?
But I think I agree a lot with Greg's take. Science fiction is very much about asking, what if this happened? What if this were true? And for me, a lot of fiction is also just about asking questions like, why do people do these things? How would it go if you were experiencing something like this. And so those questions kind of come to each other from opposite sides. And I like animals. They're kind of easier to understand than people. They give you archetypes to work with or play against, and animals are easy to spend time with. They're fun. And so, I start asking what ifs, like, well, what if this animal had a society? What if this animal was doing these things? And, so that's at the heart of it, very much a science fiction philosophy. Like, let's explore ideas. And that's what I really like to do with fiction, is explore ideas. Even when I'm writing a more character-driven piece, it's usually like, I want to explore the idea of a person who has to deal with something like this. So if I'm coming at it from this philosophical place of, I want to explore ideas and ask questions, science fiction is just the natural place for that. And animals are also a great place for it, for trying to understand people. If you start by trying to understand animals, they're simpler. They don't have all the language that we have, all of the ways to tell the complicated lies that we tell. I mean, it's not that animals can't lie. They can. If you've ever taken, a dog that's like starting limping around you because it wants attention or something, they can tell lies, but they're simpler lies.
They're a lot more sympathetic. I mean, we feel towards animals a lot more than we do towards humans, sadly.
Which is a great strength with writing furry fiction, because you get that sympathy right away for your characters.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's easy to think of animals in partly with furry, because with furry you have a character that doesn't look like you, and so you start to think differently about let's say what it means to be human, what it means to socialize. And then the next thing you know, you're seeing yourself in a character named Kanti, who is working in a Generation starship. Or for me, the other day, I started seeing myself in a star wall or a whale in space, and thinking about, like, how far can I go in the galaxy? And it's tied almost to that playfulness of like furry and personas. But I think science fiction allows that public kind of social process we go through online to take place in kind of that narrative structure that we always somehow seem to find ourselves always passionate about, whether it's movies, video games, fan fiction, and science fiction is just so useful in all the different layerings of what it can do and what it can offer us.
Also just fun. I like imaginary spaceships. I don't think I would actually like real spaceships. They sound kind of terrifying. I've seen Apollo 13. But imaginary spaceships are so fun, and robots are fun, and like high-tech computers that can do fascinating things, and just, it's fun.
Now to tie off that question, because it brings up into the part of my question, which is, have you always been interested in science fiction? Have you always been interested in science fiction? Was this something that developed simultaneously with furry? Or did you have like a film or a book or something that kind of pulled you into science fiction as a genre? This could go to anyone who would like to speak first. Greg, Mary, Rick.
I guess I've always liked sci-fi, but there's a lot of sci-fi books, especially from back, the books that were coming out when I was a kid were a lot more interested in the science than they were in the characters. And so you had to go through a lot of books to find a real keeper.
That's how I ended up. I thought for a long time.
But you had to really hunt for the gems.
I read those books and came out thinking, I'm a character-driven writer. I am not a character-driven writer. I'm an idea-driven writer. But, if you grew up reading Asimov and Arthur C. Clarke, you might get confused about that.
That might be why I was more like of a fantasy fan when I was younger. I never really clicked with the requirements of the genre. like because my taste was always tainted by like Final Fantasy and things like that, and I always wanted like the fantastic gadgetry, and all the high fantasy books are like directly based off Tolkien, and I don't really have any sort of purity on his views on technology, especially if you understand Tolkien like hated technology like with a passion, and that's came across pretty strongly in Lord of the Rings, and it affected the high fantasy genre like all the way through like to today probably. Although technology is creeping into fantasy more and more nowadays.
Yeah, the genres are whenever I teach science fiction to students and we look at like Mary was suggesting, like Asimov, Gernsback, and this like, let's talk about science, but we'll use fiction to help us along and make it interesting to people. And then compare that to today where the genres are bleeding. So you have like China Miéville, who's doing like H.P. Lovecraft in a romantic fantasy with dragons, but also the dragons are cybernetic. There's a lot more play in the works today. And I think all of you show that in different forms or variations, whether it's how are species challenging their own identity. So like in the recent books by you, Greg, Kanti suddenly made to have the almost DNA of the sarang, and like, what does this mean to be like this creature but not? Is that fantasy? Is that sci-fi? What level of sci-fi is that? It's messier now, definitely, but I think that's where furry really enters into a play space.
I don't analyze my writing that much. I just I write, I create a character and I follow the character around and make his story or her story compelling. And whether that's in a science fiction setting or a modern day setting or a fantasy setting. So I don't really analyze them, but I'm definitely a character centric writer.
Right. And even then with like the character, we follow this character along, and yet we always have to see, and I think that's partly why I gravitate more towards newer sci-fi than older, like with Mary. The character has curiosities and interests. What does the spaceship do? What is this world? What is the species? And so what does it mean that I'm suddenly this lion species? Let's see what that's like. Oh, wait, I have a relationship developing. And then you get all sorts of interesting places. Now, one of the questions that I did want to touch on is looking at furry and just thinking about how publishing works in the fandom. It's very different, of course, than larger scale publishers, whether you go to Barnes and Nobles, you go to the dark mountain known as Amazon, whatever forms or variances you go to. There's this preference between different readers on whether they like short fiction or longer works. And I wanted to ask you, just looking kind of at the publication of novels versus anthologies and collections, all of us here have somehow dabbled in kind of the anthology realm as well as the novels. Do you think that furry as a fandom space is open to both? Do you feel like readers take on certain interests in short fiction for whatever reason? Oftentimes I'll ask students why they like short fiction, say, and they say, well, it has a simple problem that can be solved and you learn a little bit about a character in a moment, versus like a novel, which is longer and expanded. And so maybe let's start off with Mary, because I know you've worked, of course, with Roar, but also your novels. Do you have an idea of the preferences or the values of either short fiction or longer works in your perspective?
Well, I think it seems like a lot of the short fiction in furry is actually driven more by writers than by readers. There are a lot of writers who want to write it and maybe want to read each other's works, and it's more of a for the love thing then the novels are more likely to actually get a lot of readers. And I think readers often really like long series. They, if they find something they like, they want more of it. So while there are short story readers out there, I don't think that's what's driving the short story scene in furry as much as the furry writing community is.
What about you, Rick and Greg? Maybe where have you fallen in terms of what you enjoy compared to like what you notice other fans enjoy?
Well, readers want is comics. But comics are a lot harder to make.
I made one for a while, but since I don't draw, I used pictures of my dogs, who you can hear now. Although these are different dogs, because it's been a few years. It's called Space Hounds. You can still find it online, but I stopped when I realized that while I was getting a readership, it was mostly people who wanted to look at pictures of my dogs, not people who were engaging with the science fiction ideas and the stories that I was telling with them.
It's sort of like with a bunch of artists who just have like OCs that they like want to create like these character sketches of, but they never really like nail it down into a story. And it's like, that's fine for them. Like they just want to make this fun stuff that's not necessarily connected into this overarching epic, but that's not really easy to sell to readers because that's just like a bunch of disembodied and disconnected ideas around maybe an attractive character design, but it's not something that a reader would necessarily get invested in unless, it happened to match a lot of their very specific fetishes or whatever.
Yeah. And with that, it's like, there are some things that could be like caught on with like the keywords of what are your interests. Do you like animal characters? Do you like transformation? Do you like aging? Do you like dragons? And definitely different forms or variances of text offer different things. For you, Greg, were you interested getting into furry and eventually like novel writing? Were you interested more in shorter works or the longer works personally?
I definitely prefer novel length and series length stories. Short stories are fine, but I want a complete story. I don't want just a little snippet. Anthologies are very popular in the fandom, I think, because so many publishers want to create them. They can just say, hey, let's do an anthology on, blank, I don't know, really, beards.
They're really fun for the writers.
Yeah, they're fun for the writers because like
theme, and then everybody's working on that idea, and you each come up with your own version.
Yeah, and every writer could just knock it out in like 2 months, and that's all the writing they need to do. And I've been working on novels for years.
From a publisher's perspective, anthologies are great. They can just churn them out and not have to go and find the novel that's this one is going to really sell. So they love doing anthologies, but certainly my story passions are going to be for longer stories. I want to write a character that people fall in love with, and then have them ask, well then what happens? It's like, let me give you some more, and just keep going with the story. That's a lot more fun for me.
Yeah, and I think back to Rick positing about comics, and just I know with like House Pets, and then I found A&H Club, and then I'm going into now with the Conti Cycle and the White Flower 2. I'm just like, wait, is there going to be a Haven Celestia comic at some point? Of course, that's a lot of work, but it's just like like, oh gosh,
literally just wrote the script like a couple days ago.
Oh dear. For you, Mary, do you have whether in the fandom, do you have like a visual series that you go to maybe that pulls at you, whether sci-fi or not?
Really not as much. about the visuals. I love words. I think in words. I like reading words. My mom's recently got me hooked on having the captions on when we watch videos because her hearing is going. And at first it bothered me, like, oh, I'm always going to be looking at the words instead of at the people. Yeah, I like looking at the words. It's great. I turn them on for myself now all the time. So like I like seeing great visuals sometimes, you know, like Star Wars movies are definitely an influence on me, but I am not as much about the visuals.
Now, I find even myself at moments dancing between the three of those, whether one moment I'll get onto comics, the next I'll be like on an anthology binge. I'll fill my library with anthologies and go through every writer and see each kind of almost dish that the writer creates and how it's different, say, from another story. But this kind of fandom practice of different little spaces or spheres from the comics, the novels, the short fiction. Do you think that it lends to kind of the active interest in furry fiction, let alone like furry science fiction? Because I know with some furry authors, science fiction is their like bread and butter versus fantasy is theirs. But do you think it's that variety of textual possibilities that gives to why so many artists and creators are creating as they do within the space?
I think they create what they want to create, and the fandom consumes what there is, what has been created. I don't know that there's any overarching plan or.
I'm also not sure that that's so different from like the broader world. There are all those different possibilities in mainstream fiction too.
Right. And the question comes out of this thinking about, because oftentimes you'll see fans think furry, it's its own separate thing. And it works in its own way. And yet a lot of the interests, practices, consumptive efforts of fans, very much we can read in the larger kind of world and just kind of what's going on. And I was just wondering kind of, how do you as a writer kind of dabble between that maybe?
If I can submit this.
Yeah.
I think that in the mainstream, readers' desires, or at least a perception of what the readers desire, that's what drives what books get published. If the publishers think that we want more boy wizard stories, and they're going to find and publish more boy wizard stories. But in the fandom, it's up to what the authors want to write.
Right.
If we want to write a bunch of sci-fi, then our fandom publishers are going to publish that because that's what they've got being handed to them. And if they don't publish it, we'll self-publish it.
Yeah, I mean, with Otters in Space, I wrote a cat who kind of wishes she was an otter and hangs out with otters. Not because there was anybody else in the world that understood why I was writing that at the time, because I hadn't discovered furry yet. Or even that I really understood it, other than it just sort of felt right. And, you know, then I found furry and I brought it to Fur Planet, and they're like, otters, spaceships? Yeah, sure, we'll republish that as like an actual, like, nicely put together book instead of this terrible pixelated cover that you've made. And then, you know, like, couple years later, I'm at a convention and I have this guy come up to me and say, I feel like a cat who wishes I was an otter. That's what I am. I was like, yes, I agree, but
I totally wrote it just
certainly
for
not
you.
market driven. Like, there was absolutely nobody out there saying, you know, what we really need is more cats who wish they were otters or dogs, because that would really sell.
Yeah, no publishers coming to me saying, hey, write something like this, because that's just not how the fandom works.
When I was asked in college, like, because I took a lot of writing classes in college, and they always
Right.
would ask, who is your audience? And I'm like, I have no clue. I don't
When I was
know.
12.
It's
That's
basically
my audience.
me when I was 8 to 20.
Yeah.
That's my audience.
Same here.
I took a creative writing course, and you get into these classes and you think this is my time to play, to learn, to grow. And I myself started writing furry text, and the professor had said, this animal stuff is not really what people want. And then next thing you know,
Totally disagree.
yeah, right. And next
What I
thing
want.
I hear I'm at a talk at a sci-fi collection we have on campus, and Nalo Hopkinson says to me, "Write what you want. Like, don't listen to somebody trying to shut you in." And I think that's why I love the fandom, is because you get to take part in what you enjoy and find people on the way who gravitate towards that. But also, like, college professors telling you what to do. Like, what?
I know Rick has told stories of his professors telling him, well, nobody wants to read that. It's like, you guys are totally wrong, because we totally do want to read that. It may not be enough for mainstream.
I'd like get a comment like, people want to read stories about humans. And I'm like, you can stretch the definition of human a lot before people start getting disinterested.
This leads into a little tangent that I have for you is, do you remember your first like furry character you wrote, and kind of the process that was? I know fans who would be listening to this, who are writers perhaps themselves, might be curious. How did you go about maybe writing one of your early stories and making it with what you were passionate about saying?
I mean, it depends on how early you want to go here. My mom started writing down the things that I would ramble when I, was pre-reading. So I think the first furry story I ever wrote was probably called Sally Cat and the Six Magic Balls. And it was about, like, I had a little plastic toy cat that was orange, and I had like 6 little balls, and I don't know, doing something with them. And there was a story. I don't remember the story, but I remember the title. And I mean, I still get toys to represent the characters I'm writing. So I guess that's part of my process. I'll get a stuffed toy that I like, and then I'll imagine it as a hero in a whole world and write a book about it.
Greg, I see you smiling. What about you?
Well, so I started writing furry around puberty, so
yeah,
you can probably guess the sorts of stories I was writing. Erotica was the first thing I was writing. So
yeah,
for furry.
yeah.
So I mean, obviously that's a big thing on your mind during puberty, and I don't know if there was much thought beyond that, except that I like animal characters and hormones are raging, and I'm going to write some stories. That's all the thought process that was going on there.
What about you, Rick? Where did you find yourself landing?
It was before that. So, because I learned to read off of Garfield comics, so naturally I started drawing Garfield comics, but only after my older brother started doing his own series, which was called Tiger, who you might know appears in House Pets now.
Yeah.
And my own character, Bino, who also appears in House Pets, I started making that, which would basically just rip off characters from Garfield, except they were dogs, because dogs were easier to draw. Like after that, like I would always just like be doodling. I'd frequently be doodling animal characters when I was like making up video games that I want to create someday. It's like animal characters were generally more unique to make than people or humans, because especially when you're like 8, 9, the humans you draw are all going to look the same. They're basically just slightly modified stick figures. When you have an animal, you have all sorts of different features you need to draw. So
Yeah,
I
I
started.
think for my, go ahead,
I,
sorry.
I started like expanding more into like actual furry ideas beyond just the funny animal stuff, like when I was in high school. Uh, because my inspiration for a comic in the new age was started when I was in like a high school art class, and we were given the assignment to draw a still life from around the school campus. I guess it's not a still life. I forget what it's called, the proper term for it, but we just like drew a scene of like
Yep.
building from somewhere around the campus, and you were supposed to change it in some way. So I just drew a raccoon character in the foreground, writing a letter about this Delaric school district that he was an archaeologist for, and that's where In the New Age started. And that's basically where my general furry writing started, was with that. Before that, I did all the fan fiction that was also furry because I had anthropomorphic Pokemon. But
Yeah.
anyway,
Never really did fan fiction. I always writing for me was a way of taking toys that like were out of reach and turning them into my own toys. So like there were the Brian Jakes books, and I loved all these mice with swords. And there were only 6 of them because at the age when I was really hooked on them, there were still only 6. So I started writing my own thing, but I didn't make it Redwall. I made it my thing, and everything was changed just a little bit so it belonged to me. And I'm still kind of doing that. Like, oh, I don't get to play with Star Trek? Fine, I'll make my own Star Trek.
I'm a huge fan of writing fan fiction. I mean, all of my published novels are technically fan fiction.
Yeah, I think every creative endeavor that I've taken on, whether it's writing my own furry stories or even growing up drawing like Calvin and Hobbes. I remember Calvin and Hobbes, they have the box you climb into, and then Calvin climbs out, he's a tiger like Hobbes. In some way has always gone down the route of, how is this linked to fan fiction? How am I really trying to like just imagine myself in this other world? But I think fan fiction, there's actually an area in academia called fan fiction studies. It's one of the little spaces that I carve myself into. And just looking at the early fan texts of like Slash within Star Trek, UC Riverside has a huge Eaton collection, and one of their collections they're proud of is the Slash fiction collection. And you can look at how and chart how fans developed from these little spaces of responding to things they were passionate about, but then carving their own directions, which definitely ties in ways back to older science fiction where you had like the pulps and you had writers commenting to each other and saying, no, that's not how you do a spaceship. This is how you do a spaceship. And then next thing you know, you have that person writing their own spaceship book that can be commented upon. Now, I think the question to kind of round out the discussion here would be, whether furry or not, what are some of your favorite works right now that you're working through, reading, maybe that you remember as you're constantly creating? And so that could be something like Star Trek or Pokemon for those of us in the chat who are fans of those different spaces. But also maybe there's another furry author that you're really into and you're really thinking alongside with as you work on your own fiction. How about we start this off? Mary, do you have any like friend authors you work with or you read their stuff and you kind of think about your own works alongside?
There's a lot of furry writers whose work I enjoy, which is why I published Zooscape and edited Roar. You can see all kinds of pieces that I've liked there. All those authors, those are. I don't publish a story unless I love it enough to read it multiple times, and I'm not someone who rereads things much, so that tells you something. But I think partly because I've been doing so much reading for Zooscape, because there's a slush pile, I get lots of submissions, I'm reading all the time, short stories there. I've my like pleasure reading for an escape lately has been Seanan McGuire's books, because it's a little bit different, and yet she's got this fairy detective series, the October Day books, and there's like 16 of them, so I know I can keep reading them for a long time.
Yeah.
And I can just sort of sink into getting to know these characters. And like they're cat fairies, which is neat. There's like shapeshifters and they can turn into cats. So there's a little bit of furry stuff in there. But it's also a way to just sort of like, okay, I'm going to separate. Right now, I just need to unwind and read from the, I'm, working on editing a zine right now. But in terms of furry writers that really stand out, probably, I really love Ian Madison Keller's work. I've read a lot of his stuff. Frances Polly and Renee Carter Hall. Amy Fontaine is, I think, the only author who got into every roar that I edited, because I've just like loved every short story of hers I've ever seen. Watts Martin wrote a great sci-fi furry book, Kismet.
Yes.
I mean, there's a lot of really good furry writers right now. It's really a great scene with a lot of people who really know what they're doing. I feel like, oh no, I'm going to be leaving people out who I should be listing, which is I think why I started by talking about Seanan McGuire, because it's a little safer than like listing people, because a lot of these people, they become your friends, right? They're who you hang out talking to in chat rooms, like, hey, I'm working on this project and I need to figure out like what type of animal the side character should be, or like how to explain this thing, and like you can bounce ideas. It's really a great community because people do just chat and give each other ideas. I mean, the whole Trigalactic Trek stuff, all of that started because there was a call for noir stories, and one of the people was saying, hey, someone should send a Star Trek holodeck story, Picard on the holodeck doing noir. And then people started being like, well, but what animal would Picard be? And someone said Sphinx cat, and I was like, well, now I'm writing that. It just like, that's right, I write cats and dogs mostly, and I can work with that. I can see that character is now living in my brain, and I'm going to have to write a bunch of stories about him.
You have a little brain parasite now that has to get worked out in some way, and until it's done, it's gonna stay in there.
Well, I don't think it's going to be done anytime soon. I mean, Trigalactic Trek turned into a collection, and then there's Nexus 9, which is springing off of it. I have an outline for Unexpected Voyage, which would be a little bit like Voyager in the way that Nexus 9 is a little bit like Deep Space Nine. And I've already got a bunch more Trigalactic Trek stories that I'll have to turn into a second Trigalactic Trek. So that one's never letting go of me.
What about you, Rick? Do you have any works within fandom or kind of around your furry interests that you always go back to or think about as you're working?
I thought about it a lot, but I do not actually consume a lot of fiction from inside the fandom. That's not for lack of trying. I keep searching out some stuff when I do have actual time and space to read, but I mostly like consume like video stuff like that, other comics, the books that I've usually read recently, or it be fantasy books from fantasy audiobooks, like Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series, which was 10 years ago I read that. Why would I think that's recent? Occasionally working my way through another Discworld book, things like that.
What about you, Greg? Do you have any texts that like stay with you, or any creators that you go to as you're working?
I don't know that I refer back to anyone's writing as I'm writing, but I do have writers that were very influential to me. But I guess I had to look up who I'm reading currently. Currently, I'm reading Daniel Potter's freelance familiars. So that's
a good
that's
one.
the
Yeah.
series that I'm currently reading. Mostly I read Furry, but I'm also a very, very picky reader. So I'll start a lot of books and then go, I don't like this one. Go on to the next one. For absolute favorites, my most favorite is The Captain's Oath. And that's Rick's second book.
Yeah.
That's my favorite book. It's incredible. Everybody should read that. Also, inside the fandom, The Sandwich by Phil Geis. All of Phil's books are a lot of fun. I think The Sandwich is probably like the 13th book of the David Birkenhead saga, but
Okay.
you don't really need to read the rest of the saga to enjoy that one. That one can stand alone. Outside the fandom, Terry Goodkind's stories, Wizard's First Rule, that was very influential on me to how to write a story that drags you along and gets you so invested that you put up with 100 pages of the main character being tortured. That's a lot to ask of a reader. And almost everything that Nancy A. Collins ever wrote. Sunglasses After Dark, all of her great werewolf stories.
Yeah.
Monsters in the Modern Day sorts of stories. I always wanted to be like Nancy A. Collins. After I read some of her stuff, I was like, oh my God, I wish that I could make a character that people care about and then just crumple them up and throw them away and have all the readers go, oh, no. Like that is power over your readers. She's heartless, absolutely cruel to her readers. She's my hero. Nancy A. Collins, mainstream.
There are some creative decisions. Like I know a lot of maybe not in the furry fandom, but a lot of fans, like let's say of Game of Thrones, in terms of the show, they see what happens to the characters, or like The Walking Dead, and they're just like, no, I can't go back to this. And yet in the corner are the readers of books like, oh, we've been through so much worse. We've lost so many loved ones in the path of reading. Just join the club here. We're already here. Now, we're getting close to our time here, and I think I want to wrap it up by asking, are there any works that you're currently working on, or anything that you want to maybe share with your readers, your listeners? I know Rick and Greg, you each are having work done in terms of audiobooks, I believe. Getting voice actors to perform your works and have it available to readers who, let's say if they're driving. I love driving and listening to audiobooks, but I always have to be careful, road versus text, that I'm focusing on. Is there anything any of you are currently working on that you would like to maybe share with the fans listening, or maybe look out for in the coming future?
Well, the audiobooks, we don't have to do a lot for. I mean, the voice actor is doing all the work and we're just listening to it going, yeah, that sounds good. Maybe you could redo this little bit here, but that's not a real taxing thing compared to actually writing a book. I'm juggling a ton of different storylines. I'm mostly focusing on writing the next Tory mystery, which would be the sequel to Reaper's Lottery. Mm-hmm. And I've over the last couple of weeks, I've started playing with doing a sequel to my my erotica, The Long Way Home. Mm-hmm. So why not more erotica?
I just finished this week writing the third book in my third trilogy. So I got to send that. Thank you. I got to send that off to the publisher, and I think there's a very good chance, because she knew I was writing a third book that would follow on the last one, and this trilogy is built off of my book, The Snake Song, which is the one fantasy book I've written. It's a squirrel on an adventure to find the lost celestial fragments. And, it stood alone, except that I had a couple of avid fans who kept poking me, being like, but I don't like the end. I want you to write more books that will fix it. Because I think at some level, I was subconsciously trying to fix the experience I had reading Martin the Warrior when it came out, which was a Brian Jakes book. And at the end, Rose, this mouse who you've become very attached to, dies. And I was heartbroken. And Martin's heartbroken because he clearly was in love with her. And, then he goes off to one of the books that I'd already read because it was a prequel. And so I wrote this end that really softens that. Like, the otter that the squirrel is in love with does not die. He ascends to, go be with this god, and which is where they were all trying. They all wanted to see this, palace in the sky, but he's the only one who gets to go there at the end. So it's so much softer. But I still had, at least this one particular fan being like, I know you have ideas for how the squirrel's going to go rescue him from the sky. You need to write those books. So the second one should come out sometime later this year. I don't have a set date. It's called The Bee's Waltz. And then the third one is The Otter's Wings. I'm hoping next year for that.
Yeah, I saw that tweet the other day, and I kind of yes at my chair, and my poor cat, she has no tail. The poor baby, she flinched off the table. Like, what are you doing? That's really exciting, and it's always great to, particularly in this day and age when you have the internet at your disposal and your writers that you're passionate about. Twitter, Tumblr, whatever streaming services they use, they make that announcement. And again, it's something to look forward to, but also very congratulatory. Like, congrats on pushing forward, because we all know the process these things take. What about you, Rick? Do you have anything in process? I know House Pets is always in motion in some way or form, and then we have A&H Club, Haven Celestia. Do you have any updates on kind of where you are at currently with your projects?
Pit Fighters 4 just got released, and
yes,
if people don't know what Pit Fighters is, it's a story I present it sort of like a shonen anime, except that it's just really, really gay instead. The fourth book in that one, they're all novella length. I think the first one's 8,000 words, and the most recent one is about 14,000 words. So they're not terribly long. They're only 99 cents each. Or you can join my Patreon and get them for free. As long as you join my Patreon for at least $3, so it's not actually free.
Legally join the Patreon. Don't try to slide out of that.
Yeah, the audiobooks. I'm caught up on my audiobooks. So the guy that we have reading them is going through Greg's now. Mm-hmm. So I'm working on book 3 of Final Days of the White Flower 2, but I've still only just started on that. But I do have the outline, so I actually know how it's going to go this time, which was not a thing that I had in place for book 2, because I rewrote that one like 5 different times before it finally started clicking. Yeah, House Pets is still House Pets. I'm still working on starting up again. But I also have I've been wanting to shuffle it into my other projects, like A&H Club and other comics that I want to do, which like the Haven Celestia comic that I hope to get started soon, which I already have the script done for it. So I will have 3 different comic projects to juggle at the same time, and hopefully it'll start getting regular again.
Yes, so I follow house pets, and then of course even Celestia. Pit fighters I haven't started yet, simply because I'm working on a dissertation right now looking at furry sci-fi and utopia, and I'm working with like Mary's Nexus 9, thinking about how does this nostalgically work against like human colonial efforts, let's say. And every time I go on to, like, let's say your Patreon or House Pets, Rick, I'm just like, oh, there's this little string going over here. There's this little strand going over here. Wait, House Pets is paused? I think that's a good thing to have right now.
Patreon is great. If I can just toss that out there.
Yeah.
It is a wonderful way to connect with readers and get the feedback and get the encouragement. It's so tough doing traditional publishing where you hide yourself in the basement for 2 years and write a book, and then, okay, some of them sold. Did people like them? I don't know. But with Patreon, you put a scene up, and 15 minutes later, people are leaving comments going, "Oh, this is great! I want more of this." It's like, okay, this is a lot more immediate.
And also, Patreon's nice is because you can subsidize your other writing. I would not have had the money to actually pay a professional to do the audiobooks unless I could scrape that money off from my Patreon income.
Yeah.
Right. And I think that also leaves open now for all of your fans, for perhaps new fans that are coming in. Where can we find you all in your works? Maybe like your Patreon and Twitter. Let's start with you, Mary. Where can we find your work? Perhaps your current zine that you're working on as well?
So there's Zooscape. It has a Patreon. But also, you can read all of the Zooscape stories for free online. Just Google Zooscape zine. I've got a webpage for my own work, maryloud.com, which will give you all the information. I post a fair amount on Twitter at Ryffnah, RYFFNAH. That's the main places to find me online.
Thank you. And what about you, Greg?
The easiest way to find my books and everything that's been published is gre7g.com, greg.com. That'll get you right to my shop. And I would much prefer people buy there instead of going through Amazon and letting Amazon take most of the money. Also, Patreon. On Patreon, I'm patreon.com/gre7g. There's tons and tons and tons of stuff that I'm putting up there that probably will never get published, but that's still fun to read. Storylines that people suggest and I write, and we'll put this character back in. It's like, okay, that sounds fun. I'll do that. May never be a completed book, but it's a lot of fun to read and it's a lot of fun to interact. And I hope people will come by. It's I only charge $1 a month and you can read everything. So it's great. It's a good bargain. A lot of fiction for $1.
Yeah, and just to hone in on that and Patreon again, I think going on your Patreon and just at that low price of the $1, seeing a way in which the stories that we fall in love with continue on is always great. I remember the last piece that I read as I got into my work, Sarsuk's Head. If you've read
Execution of Sarsuk, yeah.
Exactly. I think that's going to stay with me for a while now. I needed this in my life. I needed a way for these stories to continue, and I hope they keep going. What about you, Rick? Where can we find your work?
You can find my main page, rickgriffinstudios.com. That's spelled like my name, RickGriffin studios.com. And my Patreon is patreon.com/rickgriffin. Again, RickGriffin. That's Griffin with 2 I's, no O's, no A's, no E's.
Well, thank you so much, the three of you, for being a part of this today. Oh, Mary?
I forgot one place. Most of my short stories, you can find them for free online at deepskyanchor.com. I just, it's a place where I can reprint things after the rights are up and make them look nice and easily available. So there's like a ton of my short stories there. And a bunch of them have also been done as an audio podcast. So there's a Deep Sky Anchor podcast.
Thank you for that. I think I'm gonna go tear like my claws out now, clawing to that website. Like, no, I need it now. But thank you all three of you for being here today, for taking time out of your summer and sharing with us a little bit about your work, your interest, as well as where your projects are going. Because I think with the furry fandom, you have a community that will follow you and support you. Not a lot of people have that. And as we've suggested with Patreon, there are great ways out there for us to continue celebrating each other and our work. And so thank you again. And hopefully in the future, we'll be able to speak with one another in a convention space or two.
I'll be at Megaplex in 2 weeks. If anybody's coming to Megaplex, stop by my table. I'll be in the dealer's room.
I'll be at Furvana in September.
I'll be at TFF next year.
Just to finalize on that, could we identify where those are located? Sorry.
Megaplex is Orlando. It's the weekend of August 5th.
Furvana is on the Oregon coast in a small town that I can't remember the name of.
Somewhere on the coast.
It's
sounds
a small
mysterious, like Twin
convention
Peaks.
in a small town. It was. They've only done one in-person one before the pandemic hit, and it was lovely.
Sounds exciting.
Escape to the beach for a weekend and hang out with furries.
I don't know where TFF is. Is that Houston?
It's Dallas.
Dallas. Okay.
The
Texas Furry
cities are
Fiesta
so
Dallas.
much less
He'll be
relevant
the
than
guest of honor.
Yeah.
TFF.
Congrats, Rick. Congrats. All right, everyone. This is Brandy J. Lewis signing off with Mary
Thanks for
E.
having us.
Loud, Greg Luderman,